All right, moving on to neuroimaging studies. So this is a great time to review um, this brain image that we've looked at over and over again throughout this lecture. So we talked about Broca's area. So again, to orient you, here's the central sulcus, the frontal lobe, parietal lobe. Here's the Sylvian fissure, and this is the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe, right? So we talked about Broca's area. It's in the frontal cortex. We talked about Wernicke's area, which is somewhere over here. And another important one that you guys should know is the Sylvian fissure. And we will go over these various aspects when we talk about neuroimaging studies of language. Okay, so parts of the brain that are involved in language. So remember, this is an oversimplified model, but it's a good starting point, right? So let's start from reading, right? So visual cortex sees this input and it gets fed to other areas, and which we're going to talk about in a second. And then it gets processed by language areas, which allow us to understand what it is that we're reading. And then same thing goes for listening. When we're listening to people, we use our auditory cortex. And then presumably information gets sent to Wernicke's area as well as other language areas that then help us understand what we are listening. And then you might be asking, well, after we understand what it is that we are listening or what we are reading, and then how do we convert it to speech? So we think that that happens through areas like the arcuate that then communicate with frontal language areas, including Broca's area. And then that gets transferred to motor cortex, where articulatory processes set in, and we are then able to move our mouth muscles and our tongue and so on in order to speak what it is that we want to say. And then also there are pathways from just, rather than communicating that we have understood what is being said, we can also have independent thoughts, so we also need a way from our thought area. In general, we think of prefrontal cortex as a region that is involved heavily in thinking. And then that gets, again, sent to motor cortex, where we can then talk and produce the movements necessary. And so here's some actual data from an fMRI experiment where individuals were shown sentences inside of the scanner. And they were also shown non-word sentences, so sort of like gibberish sentences, or sentences in a different language for people. So it could be sentences in German for native English speakers, for instance. So you wouldn't be understanding what is being said, but it still sounds like language. And it's certainly produced by a human. So when you contrast the two, when you contrast sentences versus non-words, what you end up getting is a huge swath of cortex in temporal cortex and in frontal cortex. And a lot of these areas are all these areas are involved in language. So these are the frontal and temporal language areas. And you can see that some of the regions that we've been talking about with respect to language, like Broca's area and Wernicke's area, also show up here, right? So here's this crazy hot spot, which I think corresponds to Wernicke's, and then somewhere around here and here is Broca's area. So it's huge in reality. The parts of cortex that are involved in language are quite large. And we think that each of these different areas may be involved in different aspects of language. Okay, so looking through what I was just talking about. So here you would be contrasting two conditions, sentences versus non-words. An example of a sentence would be, a rusty lock was found in the drawer. And so these can be presented visually or auditorily, and you get these same areas no matter what the modality is. Okay, so here's the sentence one, and then a non-word sentence would be like, dap, drello, smop, oop, flid, cav, cri, replode. Said, and the sentences themselves, or the non-word sentences, are spoken in a nice prosody that mimics the sentence prosody too. So it sounds like a sentence, but it's really not. And so here are individual subjects, their fMRI activation, and you can see that the overall topography is the same. So you get what's presumably Broca's area in every individual, and but the precise anatomical location of these clusters of activation differs slightly from individual to individual, suggesting there might be individual variation and individual nuances. So this group then validated this localizer task. So we call it a localizer task because it localizes regions of the brain that we think are involved in language. So they tested whether or not they could reliably find these brain areas in every individual. And so these are 3 example subjects, subjects 1 activation, 2, and 3. You can see that they slightly vary across individuals, but they're approximately in the same spots. So here's Broca's, here's Wernicke's, and so on. And then they brought them back for another session at another time. So these are same individuals across a few days or weeks or months. And you can see that the clusters of activation are quite reliable across people, across sessions within subject. And then they said, well, what if we change the task a little bit? So they performed a reading and memory task where language was involved, and they also found the same types of things. So if individuals read the sentences, so the sentences were presented visually, and they also tested a version of this where they imagined the sentences, sentences and non-word sentences. They still found these same swaths of activation. And they also found that even if individuals weren't asked to respond to the sentences, when they just listened passively to the sentences, they also found the same clusters of activation. So this tells us that this individual variability across individuals is not due to noise. So it's the individual variability may in some way correspond to individual variability in how we process language, for example. And another conclusion of this paper was that this sort of task can be given both auditorily and visually. So no matter what the modality, you can pick up on these language clusters. Then you might be asking yourself, well, how about different languages? Would we be able to see these same regions? So if these clusters of brain activation are indeed the language network, then we should be able to see them no matter what language, because language is the same sort of skill and it's the same domain across people, no matter what the particular language is or no matter what the culture. So here are individuals who are native English speakers. And then here are individuals who are Spanish speakers. And they found that it's the similar type of activation, no matter what the language and culture. And then if you, again, this is another version of what we looked at before. So when the stimuli, sentences versus non-words, are presented visually, you get similar swaths of cortex that are activated. And then you can also present a different type of condition where you, instead of using non-words, you can use sort of degraded speech, and you can pick up on speech-related areas, and I will get to that in a second. So ignore this for now. Again, this tells us that across different languages, so Armenian, Celtic, Hellenic, and all of these different languages, you can get the same swaths of activation, and this suggests that the language network is quite preserved across languages, and this may indeed be a way that the brain learns to, or a way that the brain produces language and comprehends language.